Hey, how's it going, everyone? I'm Nate Schoemer, certified professional and master dog trainer, and you are watching my show on dog training. Today we are doing a live Q&A, and we are going to be talking primarily about shaping and how it relates to dog training and how we can use it while we're training and working with our dogs. There are lots of different types of shaping as it relates to dog training. And I'm going to try to go over each one. I may miss one. I think I have them all, but I'm not 100% certain. But we're going to go through these on the list. If there is one that I miss, let me know and we'll address it. Give me a moment as I bring up the chat over here on the other screen. I hope everyone's having a great Thursday so far. There we are. Okay, excellent. Okay, cool. So again, we're talking about shaping today. Now, most of the time when I am using shaping within my dog training, I'm often using a form of luring, so luring shaping. But there is something, and this is the big part about, looks like we might have a couple people joining us. A big part when it comes to shaping is what's known as successive approximation. And this is kind of like the foundation of shaping within dog training. And this is where we are giving the dog rewards, successive steps towards achieving the final picture that we want. But there are different forms of shaping in training. Now, the most common that a lot of people use is luring. So luring is a form of shaping. Some people call it luring shaping. And this is where we are taking some food, some kind of treat, and we're using that to manipulate our dog's position and behaviors within the training. And then under that, there's going to be some other ones. Like another example could be assisted shaping. And I'm going to break down how that one works as well within dog training. Now, when I'm using a lure for shaping, there are some dogs dependent on their food drive. And of course, there's going to be different levels of difficulty when it comes to training different dogs. Some dogs are easier than others. Some dogs are going to be a little bit more challenging. Things that make dogs more difficult than other dogs are going to be some of the obvious things, like if you're dealing with a dog that's aggressive, that's going to be a little bit more difficult to deal with. If you're dealing with a dog that's very fearful, that's going to make training significantly more difficult. If you're dealing with a dog that has very, very little food drive, that's also going to be difficult. Now, keep in mind that every dog does have some level of food drive. And the dogs that have higher food drive are going to be significantly easier, but we do have those dogs that maybe they've been free fed. Being free fed is one of the worst things that we can do for a dog if we want to use luring within our training. If you're not worrying about luring and you free feed your dog and it keeps them at a very low food drive and you don't have any issues, fine. But if you are trying to use a food lure to start using lure shaping to get your dog to do specific behaviors, then free feeding the dog could have some negative consequences within the training that you're going to be trying to do with your dog. Now, if I get a dog in training and that dog has very low food drive, I usually have a couple options as far as moving forward. One thing that I can do is I can try to build the dog's food drive by gradually making them work for their food in ways that are easy enough in the beginning where it's not significantly more difficult from what they're used to, but it's slightly more difficult. So some of those slow feeders, that's a good way to make a dog work a little bit more for their food. There's a video that I saw that another trainer posted where he would use a box and he would put the food, like a big box where the dog can walk inside, and he'd put the bowl in there and then the dog would go in there and eat. And then he would have the box in a different position where the dog would have to go over and eat. And then we're just gradually making it more difficult for the dog to get the food. And then we can try to start incorporating that into the obedience. There is also something known as food deprivation. And I don't necessarily care to say that too much because people take it to the extreme, or they think that it's the extreme. So you might be listening and you go, oh, food deprivation, that sounds terrible. It doesn't mean we're starving dogs. That's definitely not something you want to do. If you see a dog and they look like they're starving, they're not eating at all, that's definitely an issue. No, this is just where we're trying to build the dog's hunger to a point where they're willing to do a little bit more, put in a little bit more effort in order to get the food. Now, I've had dogs in the past, and the way that I've done it when I've worked with dogs that have low food drive is I'll bring the dog out for a session. I'll offer the dog some food. If the dog doesn't want any food, no problem. Maybe we hang out a little bit more. I put the dog up and then I try again later. And I repeat this process until the dog decides to start taking the food. And I'm not asking for very much when I'm initially trying to get the dog to take the food. Maybe I'm just getting the dog to take the food from my hand, and that could be a win. And we're going to build that up. Now, a common question that's often asked on many of my YouTube videos or statements that people make is, oh, well, I teach my dog without ever using any food. Or how can I train my dog without using food? We can teach our dogs certain behaviors without using food, but there are very specific types of movements that can become very difficult and complicated if you're trying to do it without food. So if I'm training a basic family pet and they want that dog to do a sit, down, come, stay, just some of the very basic obedience, you can do all of that with leash pressure. Now, if you've heard some of my other videos, I don't like teaching behaviors using leash pressure. I don't like to use negative reinforcement to teach a behavior. I'll use negative reinforcement to reinforce behaviors, reinforce expectations and rules, but I don't really care to teach a dog behaviors through negative reinforcement and any type of negative reinforcement. So another example of negative reinforcement, if you're pushing down on your dog's butt and you're applying that pressure and your dog gives in and they sit and you release your hand, that's negative reinforcement. You applied something the dog doesn't care for, the dog sits, you remove your hand, you just got your dog to do the behavior using negative reinforcement. Now, I might use a combination, and we have some more people jumping in. How's it going, everyone? Thanks for joining us. We might have a combination of luring as well as using some kind of negative reinforcement, and that is something that I do with dogs that I train, often to increase speed. So I might have the food as I'm going to lift the dog into the sit position. I'll simultaneously push down on the dog's butt, and then I'll give the dog the reward. That often can help increase the speed of the dog going into the sit position, and it can give them a little bit more guidance without any sort of negative association because I have food directly in the dog's face. And so with lure shaping, since this is the primary one that I often use with most of the dogs that I train, here are a few of the things that I think about while I'm using a food lure to get my dog to do behaviors. And do I have any questions so far? What's happening, Bill? Lots of lives lately? Yep, trying to do more lives. Also going to be doing more dog training videos as well. So working and training with lots of different dogs. I've actually been thinking about doing some live training sessions where I'm working with the dog live and demonstrating things while people ask questions. My puppy cry every night. It doesn't want to eat. It's new. Please help me. So I'd have to know a little bit more about the situation, but when I get a new puppy, I do a lot of management, meaning I have crates in different areas of the house. I have puppy play pens. I use gates, all these things to get my dog to build certain habits and certain routines. And at night, when I have a brand new puppy, I have the puppy right next to my bed. So not everyone agrees with that, but that's something that I've always done. So I'll be sleeping and I'll have the crate, like imagine I'm laying down, bed's here, pillows here. I have the crate right next to me and I have the puppy right there. And so a lot of times I'll just keep my fingers or hands in the crate because the way that I look at it, if I have a really young puppy and that puppy's starting to whine or cry, I don't really see it as some kind of manipulation, like, oh, the puppy's trying to manipulate us and get us to let them out. No, they're just very social creatures and suddenly they're all by themselves. That's going to be a natural response in order for the mom or the mother to find them again. So it's in the nature of the animal, if they're separated and they're by themselves, that they're probably going to cry and whine until they fall asleep. So that's why I keep them. I want them to feel secure. I want them to feel comfortable in their new environment. As they get a little bit better, a little bit more confident in this new environment, and they feel comfortable, then I'm going to start putting them in different areas to sleep. We talked about this a little bit the other day. I do... I'm drawing a blank right now on what I call it, but basically like scheduled isolation. Thank you. There we go. So scheduled isolation. That sounds bad, but I would put the dog or puppy in a certain area. They might be in a plastic crate. I give them something to entertain themselves, whether it's some kind of work to eat feeder with some raw food inside of it that's been frozen. That's a really great way to give them some time by themselves, short duration. They have a good experience with it, but they get used to being by themselves. But anyways, let's go back to luring. Excuse me. So I demonstrated this the other day, how I like to hold the food. So I'm going to bring it up to the camera so you can see. So I know that's not food, but that's how I would hold a treat. Now, when we're doing luring, what we want to think about, the type of food that we're going to use, we want something that's big enough so we're not dropping it all over the place. We want to make sure it doesn't crumble because we don't want crumbs falling all over the floor. We want it to be soft enough that the dog can eat relatively quickly so we can follow it up with another reward. We don't want something that they're going to be chewing and chomping on for a long time. So those are the main things that I look at. Often when I'm working with a young puppy, I'll use a freeze-dried dog food. When I was training Maverick, my German Shepherd, as a puppy, I was using Stella and Chewy's freeze-dried toppers. Now, these are expensive. They're usually between 30 to 40, depending on what the protein source is, per bag, and the bags are usually 1 pound. So you're not getting a lot for as much as you're spending, but I use that because it's a higher quality food and because it wouldn't crumble and it was a good size and it was a good motivator. So most puppies really like it. So it's healthy. They like it. It works great for training. As they get older, when I'm doing more training, so now when I'm training my dogs, I use N&D dog food. I like to use the Maxi Giant size, but also the medium size is pretty good too, because these pieces are pretty large. It is a kibble, so it's not the best when it comes to the dog's nutrition, but N&D is a good kibble though. It's one of the better ones. I can't say whether it's the best, but it's a pretty decent kibble. So if I'm training with a kibble, that's a good option because the pieces are a good size. I'm not dropping them all over the place. My dogs like them, so it works really well with training. Let's see if we have some more. You're not late by much. Someone said I'm late. Okay. Hand feeding is a great way to bond and assist with training. Absolutely. Let's see. Okay, I have to re-listen. Okay. What about adding small amount of tuna, salmon? So if you want to add something like tuna or salmon or something like that, just keep in mind you're increasing your dog's pay grade. At least that's what I like to call it. So when I'm working with the dog, I want them to enjoy the food that I'm feeding them for training, but I don't want to give them the absolute best thing that I can possibly give them. Because again, I look at it like I'm increasing the dog's pay grade. There's something known as positive behavioral contrast and negative behavioral contrast. So positive behavioral contrast, and I often do this intentionally in my videos. Most of the dogs that I train, even when I would do stay and train, and I don't do stay and trains as much anymore, but pretty much the first 8 years training dogs, I had anywhere from 5 to 17 dogs at the most that I was doing in a stay and train program. And one of the things that I would always do is I would film a little video of their dog at the end of the stay and train that I could give to their owners. So I'd be doing some healing with the dog, playing with the dog, just things to highlight the stuff that the dog learned while they were training with me. And when I would train these dogs, I would use their kibble. So I'm doing training sessions, I'm using their kibble. And then when I would film the go home video, I would use freeze-dried raw dog food. And so the freeze-dried raw was a bump up. It was a higher quality. Most dogs enjoy it more than their kibble. It's something different. It's something novel. And because of that, we had the positive behavioral contrast. The dogs became more excited and they performed better because I was offering them something slightly higher value than what they were used to training and working for. But we can see that, we can see that on the other side as well. If I feed my dog cooked steak or salmon or something that the dog perceives as incredibly valuable, a very, very high value treat, and then I try to offer them something different for training, we're going to get negative behavioral contrast. They're not going to perform as well. They're not going to be as enthusiastic about the training. And of course, over time, we can adjust that if we're not giving them the very high value food. But in my opinion, I like to keep them as low as possible on their pay grade as long as the food is a good quality, and then I can increase the value strategically for certain things that I might be working on. Maybe I'm going to an environment that's going to be more difficult. I know it's going to be more difficult, so enhancing the quality of the food can make that a little bit easier for me. So these are things that you want to consider when you're talking about the food. Now, when we're talking about a food lure, these are some of the things that I like to do. So, one, we talk about how we hold the hand. Most of the time, I'm holding my hand pretty much like this, where the hand is vertical and not horizontal. Now, sometimes I do horizontal when I'm doing a recall and I'm bringing the dog back into that position, but you're going to notice that the way you hold your hand is going to manipulate your dog's position as they're trying to get access to the food. So for Maverick, for example, when I'm doing the recall and I'm holding my hand, I actually do bring my elbow out pretty far to give him that straight picture so he can come in nice and straight. Because with him, if I do hold it sideways, he ends up coming in crooked. Another thing that I've seen happen to people, if they do hold their food sideways or they hold their hand sideways, their thumb gets caught a little bit more while the dog's trying to get access to the treat. So by holding it vertical instead of horizontal, then it creates this little valley for our dogs to place their muzzle into to get the reward. Another thing I try to work on and I focus on, not every dog's going to do this. You're going to get this more with your high drive dog. So you're working with a border collie or a sport type Labrador, German Shepherd, Malinois, Dutch Shepherd, you know the breeds. These dogs that are very high energy, very high food drive, this is going to be significantly easier to do. Not all dogs are going to do this. But when I do a lure, again, imagine my hands like this and not like this. I'm keeping it like this just because of the position of the camera. If I have the dog coming in, what I like to do is I like the dog really pushing into my hand. So again, this is going to be easier depending on your dog's food drive. But once they push into my hand, that's when I release the food. They push into my hand, I release the food. They push into my hand, I release the food. And the reason why is because when I'm doing a lure, I want the dog attached to my hand. I don't want a lure where my hand starts to come away from the dog and we lose the connection. And this is a very common thing that a lot of people do when they first start learning how to train and they start learning how to use a lure. They move too quickly, and I tell them, pretend like there's an invisible line that's attaching your dog's snout to the food. And once it gets a certain distance, it's going to snap and you're going to lose your dog. So you're going to be moving, you move too quickly, dog goes, oh, I'm out of here. So I like the dog to move with it. I like them to basically be attached to my hand. And I can do that by rewarding the dog as they're pushing into my hand and then releasing the food the moment that they push. And you can feel it when they're pushing in your hand. And often they're making a bunch of noise as they're trying to bite at it. That's going to help a great deal with the luring. And this is luring shaping. Now, there is also something known as assisted shaping. So one of the first exercises that a lot of trainers, a lot of people do, if they've done some research, they've studied dog training, is teaching the dog the climb command or the climb bed, the elevated dog bed. And sorry, right now I'm getting some serious ringing in my ears. That's one of the fun parts about being a machine gunner. Sorry, let me regain my focus. That ringing was pretty intense. Okay. So one of the first things we teach, we want dogs to be successful. So the more successful dogs are, again, I quote Tom Rose often on this. He says, success builds success. The more successful our dogs are, the more encouraged they're going to be to train and work with us. So we want to give them a lot of wins, especially in the beginning. So we do these communication channels, and then when we start getting the first behaviors, a lot of times we're just getting the dog to walk back and forth. So I'll guide my dog to the right. I demonstrate this with Maverick. I'll guide the dog back the other direction. I'm switching hands. One of the reasons why I often switch hands is if we always use the same hand during training, then our dog's going to focus on that one hand. So I switch hands. I go back and forth between my left hand and my right hand, and we're just working on getting the dog to go into a straight line. Very simple. Once we get that down, now we want to start getting the dog to go onto a climb bed. And I'm not asking the dog to stay on the climb bed. I just want to get them on there. Now, some dogs are going to jump right on the bed. No hesitation. Some of you probably have dogs like that. You guide them towards the bed, they jump on, enthusiastic. Great, awesome. Now, there's also dogs that are going to be very hesitant of the climb bed. I've had dogs where the bed will be in front of them and they're doing everything they can to avoid it. You're trying to lure, they're going around, they're going back the other way, and it can be very difficult if they're a little cautious, hesitant, or fearful of it. So this would be a good example of assisted shaping. The dog, you get them to place one paw on the bed, boom, we reward that. You get them to place two paws, we reward that. They place 3 paws on it, we reward that. Eventually, all 4 paws are on the climb, and now we're rewarding the dog. So we were assisting the dog towards that final picture. What we wanted is the dog being on top of the climb bed. So that's a really good example of assisted shaping. Let's see if we have any questions before I go to the next one. I found a good mix of food and treats so far. Excellent. Puppy follows food. If they don't see food, they can't any exercise. There's puppy follow food. If they don't see food, they can't any exercise. I'm not sure I understand that statement. Maybe what you're saying is that if you start with food and they see the food, they get used to following the food. If you don't have the food, they won't follow. There are techniques to get dogs, and one of the fading techniques that a lot of trainers will use. So fading is where we remove the help. So in the beginning, if I'm luring a dog and my hand's open, the dog is seeing the food, they're following it. But eventually, I like to get to a point where I can have my dog follow a lure with a closed hand. So the dog's following the closed hand into different positions, and initially I might have food in that closed hand. So once the dog gets into the position, I can follow it up with the reward. But other times, I might not have food in that hand, but if I'm going to reward the dog, I can mark the behavior and then follow it up with the reward on the other hand. This is one of the ways we teach a dog a hand touch. So when I do a hand touch, I place a piece of food in between my middle finger and my ring finger. So I hold it just like this. And when the dog comes, they take the food, great. And I do this in all kinds of different positions. So the dog gets it out of my right hand, my left hand, high, low, boom, all that stuff. And then I offer up the same picture without the food. The dog naturally goes towards it. Once their muzzle touches my hand, I mark the behavior, yes, whatever marker I'm using, and then I follow it up with the reward. So now, I'm getting the behavior without having to have food directly in my hand. Do you ever free shape healing? You can absolutely free shape healing. So free shaping is where we are not giving the dog direct guidance, but if they offer up a behavior, we can reward them. Now with free shaping, usually it takes time to get the dog to do the behavior. And a lot of trainers that do a significant amount of free shaping will use a clicker for this because it's very easy to use a clicker. And a clicker is significantly more distinct to a dog than our voice, so it's easier to get them conditioned to a clicker. And you just wait, and it's also easier because you don't have your hands full with other stuff. So a lot of times, me personally and a lot of trainers I know, we prefer to use our voice as our markers because when we're training dogs, we are using a lure, we are using a leash. If we're trying to manage the dog, we're doing all these things and our hands are full. So having a clicker is going to take up one of those hands. Even if it's attached to the wrist, you still have to get it into your hand to do the click. They have some that go in the mouth, but I wouldn't use those. And so for me, using my voice is much better. But if you're doing free shaping, you don't have to have as much stuff in your hand. So you can have the clicker and you can have the treat. And as the dog gets closer and closer to whatever it is you're trying to get them to do, you can go ahead and reward that. So technically, yeah, you can definitely free shape healing. So you start walking in an area where it's closed off, your dog's not going to take off, and your dog starts coming towards you. Boom, you mark that behavior, you give your dog a reward, your dog moves more towards the heel position, you mark that behavior. Eventually, you can get your dog walking right next to you in heel position. So yes, definitely, you can free shape a heel. You can free shape lots of different behaviors. And I talked about one of the downsides to free shaping. Free shaping is great because if we get a dog to do a behavior, there's nothing to fade, because we didn't have to assist the dog. So it simplifies that process. But when we do a lot of free shaping or we do a lot of capturing, so capturing, the difference is the dog is already doing the behavior. It's a completed behavior and you're capturing it like you're taking a photo with a camera and then you're following up with a reward to the dog. If we do a lot of that, that can be an issue if you are trying to do any sort of competitive obedience. If you're not doing any competitive obedience, probably doesn't matter. The reason why with competitive obedience, if you're out there and you're doing, let's say, change of position exercise or any exercise that requires a bit of duration, dogs that have gone through a lot of free shaping or a lot of capturing, after a period of time, if they're not given a reward, they'll sometimes offer up a behavior. And then by offering up a behavior, you would be losing points. Now, I'm generalizing this right now because, of course, if you do really good stay training, duration training, you can do free shaping and you can do capturing and you can not have those issues. But there is the chance that that issue might come up if they do too much. So a lot of trainers that do compete, they might do a little bit of that free shaping, that capturing in the beginning to create the opera dog, the proactive dog. So opera dog proactive is a dog that understands that their behavior has an effect on their environment, so they can make things happen by doing specific behaviors, and these behaviors become reinforced. And so a lot of trainers that I've worked with that do competitive obedience, they'll start with free shaping and capturing, but then usually relatively quickly they come to more direct means of communicating, so it's very clear to the dog what they want them to do, and they're less likely to have the dog offer up a new behavior if they're in a duration exercise. But again, I am generalizing this, so it's good to have again, guidelines, not rules. Okay, let's see if there's another question. My boy is really excited about food. He's the first dog I've had that I told him eye contact. Okay. Random reward after she has learned there may be a reward has helped so much with my hand signals. Awesome. Live stream sessions have been excellent. Thank you. I appreciate that. I use my voice because it works for me. Absolutely. I use my voice as well. And with the voice, again, you want to be consistent with the way that you say your marker, but dogs can learn lots of markers. So if you do, for example, say yes 10 different ways because you get excited or whatever, eventually your dog will become conditioned to all 10 ways you say yes. It's just going to take longer. So the more consistent you are, the faster, easier, and more clear the communication is. Okay, I got a 19-month-old working line German Shepherd, solid obedience, e-collar training, heals great with food or toy, but gets reactive on walks. Hard to redirect before prey drive kicks in. Any tips? So when we're looking at, a lot of times when I'm hearing about a dog being reactive on leash, I want to see what's taking place. High drive German Shepherd dogs, they can be a little difficult sometimes in those types of situations, and it's the threshold. What is the threshold for that dog that's going to get that dog to the point where they do become reactive? And if we think about everything our dogs do is based on motivation, right? Motivation to access something pleasant, prevent something unpleasant, or the behavior itself is fun, we have to figure out what approach we're going to want to take. And let's say that this is a self-reinforcing version of a dog being reactive. It feels good to bark at other dogs or people or whatever the case is, and so the dog continues to do it. So when I'm looking at a behavior that is a self-reinforcing behavior, it's not based on fear, then I look at prevent, redirect, or correct. So I prevent the dog so I don't put them in a situation where they're going to do that behavior. Or if it does happen, I quickly redirect them. I see a dog coming. I see my dog starting to get stiff. My dog's hackle starting to go up. Okay, my dog's about to become reactive. I'm going to get the dog to come back in my direction. I'm going to start rewarding and get my dog's focus on me. So that would be an option of redirecting, and that would be a good experience. The dog saw another dog and there wasn't a reaction. Or the other option is to correct it. When I say correct it, I mean some sort of punishment. And when I say punishment, I mean negative punishment, positive punishment, combination of both. So the punishment, the dog's motivation not to receive the correction has to override the motivation to do the unwanted behavior. And so if the motivation to do the unwanted behavior is more motivating than the motivation to prevent the correction or prevent the punishment, then the behavior will continue. If it's based on fear, then we want to do that counter conditioning, desensitization. There are also other options like habituation, but that's designed to desensitize a dog to something, but it can also make them more sensitive depending on the dog. There's a really great book by Pamela Reed called Accelerated Learning, and she talks about different studies in that book specifically about habituation and how they had these. I think the study involved these cats where the cats never were exposed to dogs. They exposed them to dogs. Some cats reacted poorly, some didn't. The ones that reacted poorly after they were shown the dogs over and over and over again, some of them learned, they became habituated, it didn't bother them, but other ones became more sensitive to it. And so it can have the opposite effect of what you might be going for. So sometimes we have to be careful with that as well. And then another common technique is known as flooding. You put the dog in the situation where there's so much of whatever the stimulus is that they're uncomfortable or afraid of and they can't react, and then they realize it's not a big deal. Usually that I don't recommend either unless it's a very, very controlled situation. And the only time I've used it in my career was when I had very large groups of very, very friendly dogs, and I had puppies that might have been a little cautious with dogs, and I put them with the group. They were fearful. They ran away. The group came up. They checked them out, and they're like, oh, okay. And then they took off, and they all started playing, and in a matter of like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, the puppy is running around playing with all the dogs, and it was a really good experience. But that's something that I usually tell people not to do unless, again, it's a very controlled situation, and not everyone has a group of 10 dogs that are really friendly where you can do something like that. So counter conditioning, desensitization, that's often my go-to and what I recommend for dogs that are dealing with fear issues. So we talked about luring shaping, we talked about assisted shaping. Let's talk about prompted shaping. So prompted shaping is where we are using things outside of a lure to get the dog to do a behavior. So a prompted shape could be if we're using the leash to guide the dog into the position, we're prompting them into the position. So it's not necessarily a food lure, but we are using tools to get them to do the behavior. Another example could be pointing to a climb, but I'm prompting the dog to do the behavior, and we're getting the dog, we're shaping the behavior that we want the dog to do. Pretty straightforward. There's also, I'm trying to remember what it's called. It is essentially targeting. Targeting is a form of shaping. So like, if I'm using those place bowls, I talked about this the other day when I was explaining how I would teach directions to a dog if I was to do that. By having these place bowls, that could be targets for the dog to go to. Service dogs, we often use targets. So in the show Rescue Dog to Super Dog, I used a sticky note to teach a dog how to turn on and off the lights. So that's a form of target training. They have these sticks that you can extend that have a little ball at the end, and you can teach dogs to target that as well. So there's a little series that I did with Maureen Cuccinella, excellent dog trainer, and she did this whole trick series for the channel, which was really cool of her. And one of the tricks that she was teaching was a low crawl, and if I remember correctly, she was using a targeting technique for that. So she taught the dog to target the ball at the end of the stick thing that she had, and as the dog would go to it, she would reward it so she can keep that low and get the dog to walk and do a low crawl following it. So there's all kinds of different things that we can do with targeting. I think Omar, the Hollywood trainer that does all that fancy stuff, I think he does a lot of target training as well. Do I have any questions on anything so far? Or I think it's actually not called target training or target shaping. Okay. Somehow we also just understood watch. Okay. Trying to see if there's a question. A lot of people saying hi in statements and stuff like that. I have only had Dobies, and this is different. Everything for me. The German Shepherd is super mellow and chill and doesn't seem to have instinctual for potty training, but kills it with everything else. What an answer. Appreciate it. Awesome. I'm glad it was a good answer. Thank you. All right, does my dog's down have to be fast as a service dog? Everything else is semi-quick, and he listens when needed, and told to down is kind of lazy. No, I mean, you don't need a dog to do a fast down, especially as a service dog. I mean, really, if they're doing it, and they're doing it in multiple different environments, and they're very stable, and they can do their job, I wouldn't worry about the dog being fast with their down. And often speed is really based on motivation and confidence. So if your dog is motivated, it's going to increase the speed of the behavior. Now, if we do something a long time, A dog can be motivated, but they can also end up doing the behavior slowly. And one of the issues that can cause that is being released early. So dog starts to do the behavior and they're like, you're going to release, you're going to release, you're going to release. And so they end up doing it very slowly. But that dog could be motivated. It's just how they perceive the training. Or sometimes it just becomes habit, muscle memory. They do it so many times a certain way that that just becomes the default way that they do it. Now, if I have a dog doing something a certain way and I want it to be performed another way, instead of trying to fix the command that I'm currently using for that behavior. So let's say I have down as my down command and the dog performs it very slowly. And I don't like how slow the dog does it. Or maybe the dog goes down on an angle and I don't like the dog to do it on an angle. Or maybe the dog does the down with the lazy hip. Instead of trying to fix the down command, what I'm going to do is I'm going to reteach the down. So I'm going to start with the physical cue, and I might have to do a different physical cue in a different way to get the dog to do it quickly. And then I'm going to give it a new command. So I might do plots or couche or whatever. I'm going to use a different verbal command for the down because it's often much easier to teach our dog a new command to perform an old behavior a different way than it is to try to fix the way the dog's already doing the commanded behavior. So this is something I had a few students do when I was at the Tom Rose School. They had a crooked down, and instead of trying to fix that command, it's like, okay, your down is crooked. Cool. Now you have plots, and your plots is straight. Awesome. So that's a really convenient or better way, in my opinion, to fix a behavior that the dog may not be doing the way that you want, especially if they've been doing it for a long time and that's just kind of the way that they perform it. So that's my suggestion for that. But to answer your question, I don't think a service dog has to do it down quickly. As long as they're doing it, that's great. Counter conditioning, more explanation. Okay, cool. Yeah, so counter conditioning is classical conditioning. So classical conditioning, I like to define it as a dog's recognition of a pattern outside of their control. And once they recognize the first stimulus within that sequence, that's when we see a change of behavior. And we use classical conditioning when we're doing our marker training. I say yes, I give my dog a treat. After enough of those, I say yes, my dog begins to salivate before I offer the treat. So the salivating, that is a involuntary response, and it's the response that defines the classically conditioned response to it based on the studies conducted by Pavlov and the whole dinner bell theory. Now, a dog can be classically conditioned by lots of different things. If every time you grab your leash, you take your dog on a walk, your dog learns this pattern, you grab your leash, your dog gets very excited, that's a classically conditioned response. If every time you take your dog to the car, you take him to the vet, your dog doesn't like going to the vet, you get your dog to the car, your dog starts to pant, your dog starts to shed their coat, and there's a lot of anxiety, then that's an involuntary classically conditioned response. So when a dog has a classically conditioned response to something that is negative, the dog perceives it as negative. It could be fear-inducing. It could be the dog just doesn't like it. Counter conditioning is where we are taking that response to that stimulus and we're changing it by changing what it predicts. And this is typically commonly used for fear-inducing behaviors or fear-inducing stimulus. So a dog sees something, creates a fear response. So let's use the car going to the vet. If I have the dog that goes to the car and that dog starts to freak out because it believes it's going to the vet, if I wanted to counter-condition the dog to that, I would bring the dog to the car and then I would do something different. I'd bring the dog to the car, I would do something fun. Bring the dog to the car, I'd feed the dog. So I'm changing what the car means, counter-conditioning the dog, getting that classically conditioned response to no longer be this fear response based on what the car originally predicted for that dog. So that's what counter-conditioning basically is. I've watched many of your videos. Is your yes marker also a release or is it a duration marker? Most of the time, most of the dogs I'm working with, I use yes as a duration continuation marker. Free, I use as my terminal marker, and get it, I use as my secondary terminal marker. So that's how I use the markers. It often does confuse people. Same with the word wrong. I use wrong as a marker for negative reinforcement, and people think it's a punishment, which it's not. Or people will hear me use free and they think it's just a release word, which I use it as a marker. My release word, or some people call it a neutral release, is the word break, where it means you're released, but you're not going to get a reward. Okay. My German Shepherd will not pee outside during walks, only at home. Suggestions. So with that, usually what I'll do is you kind of have to wait the dog out. They will eventually go. So if you know there's a certain time when your dog's going to have to go. So like in the morning is a great opportunity. It's been all night. Dog hasn't gone to the bathroom. You go outside and you just wait. And so maybe take a Saturday or whatever. Once the dog goes, big celebration, big praise, give the dog rewards, do something the dog enjoys, and repeat that until the dog starts to realize, okay, going outside is perfectly fine. I don't have to do it in the same spot every single time. But making it close to the spot that your dog normally goes is going to help with the process. So if your dog normally goes in the backyard and your backyard has grass, make sure you're in an area where there's grass. This is something that people usually run into issues if they've lived in a place where they've always had grass and that's where the dog has always gone to the bathroom. And then they move somewhere like New York and there's no grass anywhere. And the dog's like, I don't know where to go to the bathroom. So we can make it easier by making it similar to the spot where the dog is used to going. Another thing that I've seen people do in the past is they'll use one of those like potty areas for dogs, like a mobile grass station that you can move around. They'll get them to use that in the area where they normally go, and then they'll gradually move that to different locations to where the dog goes, okay, I can go to the bathroom here because you're bringing something that they literally go on. And then as they do that enough times, you can remove that. You can fade it just like you could fade a lure. Okay. There's also something for shaping. I'm trying to remember if it's called physical shaping or modeling. So this is a form of shaping where we are physically putting the dog into positions. It's not as commonly used anymore, but if I'm taking a dog and I'm physically pushing them into the down, I'm physically manipulating all their body positions and then giving them rewards after, that would be a form or version of modeling. Okay, let's see what other questions. Dog potty training a week. Yeah, sometimes we luck out. I've had dogs in the past where I had to do 0 potty training, even with a puppy. So I had 2 golden retrievers before I became a professional dog trainer, and those dogs just my male golden retriever never had any accidents in the house, and I had him loose. I wasn't a trainer, so he was like loose all over the place. And then my female, I think she had 1, maybe 2. It's kind of crazy. Some dogs make it very easy. I can't get focused with my border collie. Her prey drive is set in and chases birds. Yeah, and that's when we build the foundation in environments that are less difficult. So this is something I talked about a good amount yesterday, environmental difficulty assessment. So we have to look at the environment, determine how difficult it is for our dog based on the training that they've already had. So with very, very high prey drive, that sort of environment is going to be what I would categorize probably as a level 5 environment for that dog. And so we have to work up to that because you're working against these external motivational factors that are pulling your dog's attention away from you. All right, so teaching a send out. I'm trying to think. Anyone who's listening, did I miss any shaping? So we talked about assisted shaping, we talked about luring shaping, we talked about free shaping, we talked about capturing, we talked about successive approximation, modeling. If there's anything that I missed, please let me know. Okay, I'll answer this question then. Can you help with teaching a send out? Even though it's not directly related to shaping, but it kind of is because we're shaping a behavior, so I think it's appropriate. So, and my buddy asked that question, Bill. All right, so with the send out, the way that I teach the send out and the way that I've always taught it is I first start, and I do have a video on this, I start with something that the dog wants, and usually a treat is very easy, and I have a target. So I've used my phone before in the past. I set my phone down, I put the treat on top of the phone, and I move my dog away from the target. So I don't increase the distance of the target away from the dog, I move the dog further away from the target. And so first I start really close. I have the dog next to me. I like to show my dog by pointing. So I'll use a little knife hand and I'll point to the dog where it is. They'll follow my hand, and then they'll get the food. I'll reload that. I'll increase the distance. I'll aim again, and I'll walk with the dog and show them where it is. And I'll do it over and over again as I increase the distance. And eventually what's going to happen is you're going to point, the dog's going to look, and as you give the signal, the dog's going to take off at the target. Once the dog is starting to do it pretty successfully and without making too many mistakes, so what can happen on occasions is you may send the dog will start to go out, and you're like, great, the dog's doing it. And then the dog's like, oh, wait, what am I doing? So I want the dog to be pretty successful most of the time. Once I get to that point, then I'll start adding the command. So I usually use run. So I say run, and then I send the dog. Now, if you have someone to help you with the training, this makes it very convenient. So when I would be doing it by myself, I would send the dog. Once the dog takes off, I play with the dog a little bit. Maybe I'll toss a piece of food or a treat. I'll put a piece of food back on the target. I'll get the dog's attention, and I'll go back to a spot and I'll send them again. Or I could work on a sit stay, depending on where the dog is in the training. So I can send them out. If I'm training by myself, the dog gets the food. They come back to me. I reward them again. I put them in a sit. I go and reload. I come back. I send the dog. That's fine too. And that's fine because the dog is waiting for a return. So one of the rules that I like to follow when I'm first teaching a stay is, you could remember it by saying, if you can't touch your pup, don't free him up. And the reason why we do that is because when we're building the foundation of teaching a stay, we want the dog to think that we have to come back to them in order to release them. One of the mistakes that we often make is we place the dog into the sit, and then we go 10 feet away from the dog and we call the dog to us. We put the dog in a sit stay or down stay. We increase to a certain amount of distance. We call the dog to us. And after doing this enough times, the dog goes, oh, I know what you're going to do. You're going to call me, and they'll break the position and come to us before we release them or call them. So by building the foundation where the dog has to wait for us to come back is the ideal way to do that. And then later you can release the dog from a distance and you can do recalls, but you want to be careful that you don't do it too much in a pattern that the dog's going to recognize, and they're going to start breaking the position once you get a certain distance away from them. But when you're doing it for the send out, you don't really have to worry about that. You just have to make sure you're watching them, because if they do break the position, of course, you're going to have to reinforce that. As the dog gets better, what I'll start doing is I'll start using toys. Now, if you're throwing a toy over the dog's head, you have to be very, very careful that your dog doesn't see you throw it. What happened with me with the dog in the past was I used chuck it. So I had a chuck it with a ball, and I would send the dog, and the dog would take off, and he looked back as I threw the ball. And so he caught me, and then what he did every single time was he would run, he would look at me, and then he would take off. So he basically did a spin every single time that I did the send out. Even if I didn't have a ball anymore and I had a target out there, I would tell him to run. He'd run, look at me, and take off every time. So if you were to compete, that would be an issue, of course. If you're doing it for fun, it really doesn't matter. What some trainers do is they'll get those ball dispensers, and they'll have a ball dispenser out in the field. So then they send their dog, they press a button, and it launches a ball. But we want the dog to believe that there's always something out there for them. That's why they're taking off. It's not like we just have a dog and we tell them run, and the dog's like, all right, I'm going to run until you tell me to stop. No, they believe that there's something out there that they're running after, that they're going to get, whether it's a toy, food, something. So every time I do a send out, I have something out there for the dog. And the only time I wouldn't have something out there is if I'm testing. So when I went to the Tom Rose School, I had to do a Schutzen 1 routine, Schutzen 3 routine, IGP, and also AKC utility. And all these have send outs. And so when I sent the dog and I didn't have a reward, it was during the test. So my dog still runs out with speed and excitement, thinking and believing that there's a reward out there for them. Okay. All right, let's see what else we have. Let's go back into a little bit more. I want to talk a little bit more about the luring part of shaping. So again, we hit on all the main ones. If there's any questions about any of those, let me know. But with luring, there's so much that we can do. So luring, I think, is one of the most powerful tools that we use in dog training to show our dogs very specific behaviors that we want them to perform. So I already talked about how I like to handle the food, how I like to hold my hand, and how I like to get my dog pushing into my hand. Once I have that, and I also work on getting my dog to go in a straight line, I work on going back and forth. So all these are also on my course on Sit, Stay, Learn. So if you go to Sit, Stay, Learn, and you find my course on there, it's called From Novice to Pro. I go over all these different food handling exercises. But one of the exercises I like to do that develops what I like to call power steering, a term I picked up from Forrest Mickey, really good trainer, is I take the food, I place it in my hand, and then I put my hand up against, so imagine it's in between your two legs. So you have your hand between your two legs, and your legs are providing barriers on the left and right side of your leg. And you're going to rotate. So imagine you have a string that's hanging straight down from your hand to the ground. And you want that string to stay straight. And so you're basically going to walk around that. Very similar as if you were doing this with a bowl. So if the dog had a perch or a place bowl where they put their front paws on the bowl, it's the same sort of concept, but you can do it without the bowl. And as you have your hands locked up against your body and you're walking that way, it prevents your dog from going around your hand. I demonstrated this the other day as well. If I go to turn my hand, and there's nothing blocking my dog from going around my hand, a new dog is going to go like this. So they're going to go, maybe I can get the food through here. But when I turn my hand, I want the dog to turn and follow it. Any way I turn my hand, the dog's going to follow it. That's how we get a dog to really move in very, very precise positions. That's the way that I like to do it. So by keeping it up against my hand, when I go to move, the dog can't go around it. So the only option they have, if they're going to stay connected to where the food is to shift their back hip. And once they do that, that's when I release the food. I reload, I do it again. And I want to be able to pivot both directions, left and right, around this invisible circle that I've created with my dog pivoting and going back and forth with me. Then, once I have the dog doing that, now I'm going to do the same thing. I drop my hand straight down. Now I don't have my body acting as a barrier, and I can start rotating my hand that way as well. And so now I have the dog pivoting and moving simply by turning my wrist the smallest amount, and that's going to get our dog to shift and move their back end with the actual movement of our hand, which is going to help a lot with the luring. Now, I'm going to talk about this more on another live Q&A, and that is when we add commands. So this is something that has been asked in lots of my videos, because in a lot of my videos, I'm demonstrating how I'm using some kind of shaping technique to get a dog to do a behavior, whether it is a lure or it's assisted shaping or it's free shaping or something like that. And I'm not putting a name to the behavior. And so when it comes to naming our commands, so giving a verbal cue for behavior, in the beginning we start with all our physical cues or our physical prompts, whether it's a lure or I'm using a leash or I'm doing something like that to guide the dog into the position. That's our physical cue that gets them to do the behavior. When we are teaching dogs things, keep in mind we want to break it down to the smallest amount of steps possible to make it as easy as possible for the dog to learn. So before this, we talked all about building communication systems. And so luring and leash pressure is also part of my communication system. But I'm trying to establish how I can communicate very clearly with our dogs. When people trained years and years ago, and even when I first started learning training techniques, you would take a brand new dog out and you're trying to teach the dog a sit or a down day one, before the dog even has any of the communication or before you develop that system to be able to communicate with the dog. So we break it down into multiple pieces because we want our dogs to focus on one specific thing at a time. And then once we get that down, we start to add to it. And so there's two main reasons why we don't want to start using a verbal command to prompt our dog into a behavior until we have the physical cue down exactly the way that we want. So we want the dog to perform it. There's a saying, I don't know who came up with it, but don't name it till you love it. So don't name it until the dog is doing it exactly the way that you like, and you're able to get them to do it every single time that way. And so the two reasons are, one, there's a term known as learned irrelevance. So when we are, and this is also something that goes in line with our clicker work. So if I have a clicker, clickers work very well because again, they're very distinct and it's a new sound to the dog. We talk all the time, and our dogs learn to ignore most of the things that are not relevant to them. I heard a great analogy on this, and this will make sense to you. So the analogy that I heard from a fantastic trainer, he said that think about when your phone rings. The first time your phone rings, your dog might recognize it, but after enough of those, the dog realizes that the phone has nothing to do with them. It rings, you answer it, you ignore the dog, you talk on the phone, and it is not relevant to the dog. So they ignore the phone. Phone rings, they ignore it. Doesn't mean anything to them. But the doorbell rings, and now you go to the door, someone's there, the dog sees someone. Now the doorbell is very relevant to the dog. So when the dog hears the doorbell, you get a reaction from it. So you have to think about what the dog sees as relevant to them. And if something is presented to the dog over and over again and they can't connect it with something, they learn to ignore it. So if I start telling my dog down before I can get my dog to do it, and I see people do this all the time, down, 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 or they do it with sit, 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 sit. If I'm saying a command a bunch of times and the dog can't connect it with anything, they're learning to ignore it. It's becoming irrelevant to them. And then when we are able to start connecting that with the behavior, it's going to take us longer because now we have to get through the dog thinking that that specific sound was not relevant to them. So we don't name it until we can get the dog to do it every single time. So that's reason one. Reason two is we want the dog to perform the behavior the way that we like when we are ready to name it. So most commands can be pretty straightforward, especially if you're not too concerned with precision. You just want the dog to do it. Once you get the dog doing it, you can name it right away. If you do care about precision, whether you're competing or not, like I haven't competed. The only thing I've done outside of the school as far as, I did the AKC Novice Open, utility, Schutzen routines. I did all that at the school when I went there. And I did a BH. So BH is the entry level for IGP. Maybe I'll compete in the future. I've actually been thinking about it a little bit more recently. But I enjoy doing precision obedience with my dogs, even if it's not something I'm going to do for competition. I just enjoy it. My dogs enjoy it. So it's something that I like to do. And so when we care about that type of precision, then it also matters when we name the command. And one of the best examples I have for this is when we're teaching our dog the flip finish, where they go from sitting directly in front of us into the heel position. And if you've seen me teach this, when I first teach it, I teach it in a very elaborate, I step back with my left leg, I bring my hand very far back, and then I guide the dog into the sit position. So the movement that the dog ends up doing is they go way out like this and they come back. Now, if I can get the dog to do that every single time, and now I name the behavior, I say heel and I show the dog the cue, that big movement is going to be the way the dog does the flip finish. But if I want the dog to go from here and flip into the position, I'm not going to name it until the dog's doing it that way, because that's the way that I want the dog to perform the behavior. So these are things that we have to think about. Now, there's also something known as spatial pressure. So spatial pressure is something that I often use with dogs when I'm training and working with dogs. I'll give you an example. Once I get a dog understanding the concept of leash pressure, and we talked about this the other day, I don't like to use leash pressure to teach behaviors. I teach the dog leash pressure to reinforce behaviors. So I don't like to teach a dog leash pressure until I can get them to do all the behaviors. So whatever usually in most cases comes first is what the dog is learning. So if I take the leash and I lift up on the leash, that's what I'm teaching the dog. Now, let's say this dog knows the verbal sit command. So you say sit, this dog sits every single time. But this dog doesn't know leash pressure. And let's say this dog doesn't know a very good stay. So the owner did a great job teaching the verbal down and the verbal sit, but this is the type of dog that sits and jumps up right away every single time. Never learned to stay, but doesn't know how to respond to the verbal command sit. I can use that to teach leash pressure. I can apply the leash pressure. I can tell the dog sit, dog sits, turn off the pressure, yay, good dog. I'm using the verbal command sit that the dog already knows to teach them the leash pressure. So think about it this way. You're presenting your dog with a problem. When we use negative reinforcement, there's only one right answer. There's many wrong answers, one right answer. So when we're teaching it, we're presenting the problem. So here's the problem. I'm applying leash pressure. Do you know the solution? And in this situation, the only solution to this problem is sitting. Turning and biting at the leash is not going to do it. Flopping around, all that stuff's not going to, resisting is not going to do it. So the only option is for the dog to sit. So I can A, wait for the dog to figure out the solution to the problem, or B, I can do what I prefer, and I give the dog the answer. Whether I give the dog the answer by telling them to sit if they already know the verbal command sit, or I can give them the answer by using a food lure, which is usually what I do with most dogs, because most dogs, when I'm teaching them leash pressure, they don't already know the verbal command. So same thing with the down. I apply the downward pressure. The only right answer is for the dog to lay down. Resisting is not the right answer. Keeping your butt up and your head down is not the right answer. Biting at the... None of that's the right answer. So instead of trying to let the dog figure out the solution to the problem, I apply a little bit of leash pressure. Dog's like, what's that? And then I lure the dog. I release the pressure. I reward the dog. Now I'm getting the dog to perform all the positions using the leash. And when done correctly, you can get a dog to move in all kinds of different positions without the leash even becoming tight, because they now see it as a cue and not so much as force. It's another way to get the dog to perform the behavior. And one of the ways that I use spatial pressure is I'll have the leash on the dog. The dog's in a down directly in front of me. I tell the dog sit, and then I take a step towards the dog, and most dogs will pop right up into a sit. Yes, if that's a terminal marker, I can get them, release, reward them, free, whatever marker it is that you're using. So there's ways we can use a little bit of spatial pressure to manipulate our dog's position as well. Now, when I have my dog pushing into my hand, if you have a dog that's really pushing into your hand hard, so most of my dogs do, actually all of them do, Ari, Charlie, and Maverick, if they push into my hand, what I can do is I could push back into their, basically back into their snout as they go into the down position. So what happens is their front paws stay in place as they drop back into the down. Now, if they don't push into it very hard, I go straight down. So I bring them straight down and they lay into the down position. I demonstrate that with a German Shepherd puppy on my channel as well, Harley, when I was doing her service dog training. We can go straight down. That works really great with a lot of dogs. Or another option that I do is I also teach dogs what certain touches on them mean certain things. So we talked about that a little bit earlier, where we can manipulate the dog's position by using physical force. But again, I don't like to physically force the dog. I teach it as a cue. So if I want the dog to know that pushing down on their butt is a signal for them to sit, just like I teach them leash pressure. So remember, we apply the pressure, then we give the dog the answer. I do the exact same thing with this. I apply a little bit of pressure on the dog's back end, close to the base of the tail, not on their back, definitely not on the center of their back. Close to the base of the tail, that's where I apply a little bit of pressure. After I apply the pressure, I do the food lure, dog sits, I release the pressure. I do this over and over again to a point where I just touch the dog right here, boop, the dog sits. I do the same thing on the dog's shoulder blades. So I get to where their shoulder blades are, not, again, center of their back. That's a common mistake. People start pushing on the center of their back. I get right to where their shoulder blades are. I apply a little bit of pressure. Then I lure the dog into the position. Of course, this is not what you would want to do if you're training a service dog that is doing counterbalance. For a dog that's doing counterbalance, where if you were to lean or fall, you can apply pressure and the dog pushes back into you to provide that additional support. In that situation, we just do the opposite. We apply a little bit of pressure, excuse me, the dog's classical opposition reflex kicks in, and we release and we reward. We apply a little pressure, dog pushes back, we release, we reward. So we reward the opposition, we reward the resistance. So it depends on what you want. But once I get the dog understanding that if I touch up here and I apply a little bit of pressure, the dog's going to lay down, then I do that with the food lure. So I apply pressure and food lure simultaneously. And then I do that with the food and the butt as well. So I can start getting the dog to do these behaviors with that food lure, and they're pushing very hard into the hand. And also keep in mind, when we're doing the lure, we want our dog attached, not separated. So I like them to be close to my hand in order to control and manipulate their position a little bit better. Okay, so we are already over an hour. I do have a virtual training session coming up here very shortly. Do we have any questions before I have to end this? And I hope this one was helpful. I figured this one was going to be shorter. So we did talk a decent amount about shaping and how it relates to dog training. Definitely do some more reading and researching on it. Again, check out that book, Accelerated Learning by Pamela Reed, if you're really interested in understanding a lot of the learning theory behind dog training. It's an excellent book, and I recommend it to pretty much anyone who's a dog trainer. Like putting on my shoes, they know it's coming and get excited. Yep, that would be a classically conditioned response. My puppy hears your voice on video and thinks it's time to train. That's awesome. Flip finish to center looks flashy. Yep. So and I like that flashy stuff as well. It's one of the reasons why I was attracted to Nino's course, because if you look at Nino from STS K9, his stuff is very, very flashy. Okay, awesome. So just a reminder, tomorrow we have the live Q&A with Larry. And then the following week, I'm going to be doing an interview with another another trainer. I don't have the trainer locked down yet. So there's one that I'm still waiting on. He's not 100% certain if he's able to do next week. But if he's not, I have another one who I'm going to be doing an interview with next week. And I think I mentioned this before, but the way that I'm structuring my interviews, and I have a whole list, so I have the whole year covered with people that I'm going to be doing interviews with. The first interview is going to be pre-recorded, so I'm going to put together questions specifically for them, what they specialize in. We're going to talk about that for an hour, and that's going to be posted after we film it, so it's not going to be a live one. And then the following week, we'll be doing a live one. So very similar to how I did it with Larry. Larry and I filmed it, posted it later, and then we're going to be doing that live Q&A tomorrow. I believe 8:30 is the time, 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, or 5:30. Double check. It might be 8, but I'm pretty sure it's 8:30. So make sure you guys are there to check that out. I'll put up another list, maybe Sunday, maybe Monday, of live Q&As and what times we'll be doing them next week and what exactly we're going to be going over. So again, I hope this was helpful. Thanks again for hanging out, tagging along, commenting, being part of the chat. It's always a blast, and I'll see everyone in the next live Q&A.